One of the main ideas from the first 5 chapters of the text is the concept that human behavior is influenced by the values people hold dear, and people's values are shaped largely by their underlying worldview. Everyone has a worldview, whether they know it or not. Simply put, a worldview is a comprehensive framework of beliefs that helps us to interpret what we see and experience, and also gives us direction in the choices that we make as we live out our days. For most people, this comprehensive framework of beliefs is something taken for granted. Worldview beliefs are often assumed to be true and are rarely brought to the surface for examination. But we must examine assumptions because this is where decisions start and actions germinate. Our assumptions about what is ultimately real have a lot to do with what we value and the choices we make based on those values. This is why our mind is such an important part of our makeup. Our ideas about what is really real have consequences. In biblical terms, our worldview ideas can either set us free or take us captive. The Apostle Paul urged early Christians in Colossians 2:8 to see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception according to the traditions of men. Then, in 2 Corinthians 10:5, he spelled out the importance of taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. It's a basic choice. We will either take our thoughts captive to the obedience of Christ, or we will be taken captive by thoughts opposed to Christ, thoughts that are in accordance with the traditions of men that sway us with whatever prevailing notions are in fashion. One of the most helpful ways to not be taken captive by thoughts opposed to Christ is to think in terms of the big picture. It's this bigger picture that determines how we see the smaller aspects of our daily lives. We interpret smaller parts in light of the larger whole. The smaller parts of life are things like washing dishes, weeding the garden, or taking out the garbage. But it's also things like paying our taxes, putting in a 40 to 60-hour work week, although these things may not seem so small, but they really are small compared to the larger whole of your worldview. This larger whole that we're talking about can be summarized by 5 key questions. First, who or what is the ultimate authority or highest power? And what is the nature and role of this force or entity? Second, what makes up all the stuff of the universe? And how did it get here? And is there more to it than meets the eye? Third, who are human beings? What gives them value? What happens when they die? And how do they know what is true? Fourth, how do people determine right and wrong? And fifth, is there a reason, a purpose for all that exists? Answers to these 5 questions form the core of every worldview on the planet, whether it's a Christian worldview, an atheist worldview, a Hindu, humanist, or animist worldview. All worldviews answer the same 5 questions. Problem is, not all worldviews answer them in the same way. Boiling it down to simple terms, a worldview is a big picture of reality, shaped by conscious beliefs or subconscious assumptions about God, creation, humanity, moral order, and purpose. Conscious beliefs or subconscious assumptions in these 5 areas shape culture, whether it's the culture of a family or the culture of a nation, the culture of a school, or the culture of a company. In Chapter 2 of the text, there's a video clip about John Beckett, the chairman of the Beckett Companies in Ohio. In this video clip, we can see at least 4 beliefs that have shaped John Beckett's workplace culture. First, my main mission in life is to know the will of God and do it. Second, I see my role in the work world to take what I believe as a Christian and translate that into practical day-to-day expressions of what I believe. Third, every individual is created in the image and likeness of God. And fourth, Family comes before work. John Beckett's biblically shaped worldview has formed the values of the Beckett companies, and these values have in turn formed the policies and practices of the company. In the process, a unique business culture has been created to the glory of God. This course is about shaping the culture of workplaces, whether large or small, be they factories or households. The objectives of this course are as follows: to bring biblical worldview premises into focus, to determine values stemming from those worldview premises, and also to consider workplace behaviors that flow from those values. The goals are to invigorate the workplace, to renew the community, and to transform culture. One of the biggest challenges to invigorating the workplace and renewing the community and transforming culture is Platonic dualism. The text refers to it as a convincing lie. What makes Platonic dualism so convincing is that it does bear some resemblance to the truth. Plato viewed the world in terms of unchanging, eternal, perfect ideals that stood in contrast to changing, temporal, and imperfect things that came and went with the passage of time. He referred to the physical, temporal things in life as matter, and the eternal ideals as forms. Plato viewed the temporal world of matter as inferior to the eternal world of forms. The material world consisted only of temporary and imperfect shadows of the perfect ideals which lie above and beyond. While it is true that there is a difference between eternal and temporal things, the Bible tells us Christ made them both. Yes, some things are temporal, and some things are eternal, but Jesus is Lord of all, both the visible and the invisible, the temporal and the eternal. It is all His. He owns it all, and He sustains it all. Yes, some things are temporal and pass away, while other things are eternal and never decay. And it's true that it's vain to live your life for the pursuit of material things, but does this mean that temporal things do not have real significance? Does this mean that only eternal things have true value? The eternal world is not a place to which we escape, and the body is not the prison of the soul, as Plato spoke of it. Here's an important biblical truth. We do live in a fallen world, which is not the way it was originally made to be. But we do not live in a forsaken world. God, who made the world and everything in it, gives to all life, breath, and all things. In Him we live and move and have our being. Right now. God is holding your body together as you watch this animation. And your physical body is part of God's good creation. And God has not abandoned His creation. Psalm 24:1 tells us, "The earth and everything in it remains God's own possession. Therefore, it has great significance." The historical outcome of Plato's double-decker bus idea created a disastrous gap between the temporal and the eternal realm, and between the physical and the spiritual realm. This gap is unbiblical. Both realms are God's realms. The Bible does not devalue the physical world, quite the opposite. We are called to engage directly in the physical world through work. Interaction with the physical world in the form of work is a good and honorable thing, especially when done heartily as unto the Lord. In this regard, work can be worship. When we do our work in this temporal, physical, imperfect world, we are actually engaging in the very intention that God had in mind for human beings before He ever created Adam and Eve. How can we know what intention God actually had in mind for humans before He made Adam and Eve? It's not so difficult. We can read about it in Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28, where His intention for human beings is spelled out right there in black and white. Quote, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over all the earth." End quote. God's clear intention for human beings was that we would govern over all of creation: the fish, the birds, the plants, the entire earth. The fact is, you and I were created to be earth tenders. This is the role and function God had in mind when He created us in His likeness and image. It's God's order of things. The first commission given by God to humans is to govern over all the earth. Here's the big problem with Platonic dualism. It keeps many sincere Christians from feeling great about engaging with this physical, temporal world. Many of us see our work with temporal things as a colossal waste of time. We see eternity as having real import. We see pastors and missionaries doing the real work of God because they're dealing with eternal matters of the soul. This mixture of Platonism with Christianity eventually led to a religious dualism in which all of life was divided into higher and lower realms. Today, we call the upper realm the sacred, and things in the lower realm the secular. In the realm of the sacred, people put going to church or listening to a sermon. In the realm of the secular, people will put things pertaining to the physical and temporal realm of human affairs, like baking a pie. But we need to think again about this faulty big picture. Could it be a mental trap? Ask yourself, is there any part of life not related to the Creator and the Sustainer of all things, whether temporal or eternal? Are there any aspects of the physical creation that exist independently of God, somehow on its own, divorced from His ownership, His interest, or His care? And where exactly is this so-called secular world anyway? Fact is, it doesn't exist. Yet we have talked about it for so long, we think it's really there. Most of us are infected by this SSD, the mental condition that gives credence to the secular-sacred divide. One of the purposes of this course is to help us think differently about all of this and to view our work in this temporal world through a much different lens. The answer to the problem of SSD is to replace it. Replace the upper-lower idea with a right-left idea. The right-left idea looks like this. You can list every endeavor known to humanity in the center of the circle, from business, education, and law, to medicine and media. Any one of these endeavors can either be done in harmony with God's design, fulfilling His will, in line with the kingdom of light or good, or we can work in conflict with God's design, contrary to His will, in line with the domain of darkness or evil. John Beckett chose to intentionally align his business policies with God's design. But that same business could also be done in a way that conflicts with the design of God. It works the same for art, or sports, or politics, or anything else humans do in this temporal world. The bottom line is, God purposes to do His will on earth as it is in heaven, and by His grace, He will work through redeemed people to bring His light to every sphere of life. It's about the here and now as well as eternity. We don't have to wait. To help bring meaning to all kinds of work in the temporal world and to experience God's pleasure in it, you will be introduced to some practical tools that will help connect everyday work to the bigger picture of God's purpose and design for the things He has made, and to see your role in that big picture more clearly. The first tool is called the Awesome Activator, explained at the end of Chapter 5. Along with this tool, there are helpful resources such as 99 Truths About Work, Economics, and Human Flourishing, and questions for contextualizing work. That is, questions for putting any kind of work into the context of the big picture of a biblical worldview. These resources will enable you, and those that you share them with, to be rid of the sacred-secular divide and to experience God's pleasure at work. All kinds of work.